So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of Ripping Things from the Headlines. There's a source sheet in the chat, which we'll be referring to. And this week's topic is Don't Let Them Eat Meat, responding to bans on shechitah. You see an article last week, a press report, the JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Greece's top court nixes ritual slaughter permit, calls for an alternative solution. And this has been in the news most recently over the last couple of months. It's a topic that has a long history in the last 150 years or so, at least, of different bans against shechitah, the way Jews slaughter animals for meat consumption. But the most recent headline had to do with the fact that the highest court in Greece has ruled against current regulations allowing ritual slaughter, fulfilling fears that some Jewish leaders voiced last year after European Union's top court ruled in support of such bans. The court nixed the current slaughter permit provided through a ministerial decision that exempted ritual slaughter from the requirements to stun animals prior to killing them. Judges said lawmakers must work out a way to meet demands of animal rights advocates and the needs of Jews and Muslims who follow the laws about food in their traditions. The government should regulate the issues of slaughtering animals in the context of worship in such a way to ensure both the protection of animals from any inconvenience during slaughter and the religious freedom of religious Muslims and Jews living in Greece, the court said, according to the Greek news site Protothema. Not really sure, you can avoid inconveniencing animals if you're slaughtering them, but we'll talk a little bit about that. Last December, the EU's highest court upheld the bans imposed in regions of Belgium against slaughtering animals for meat without stunning them first. The ruling meant that slaughter in accordance with Jewish law, which requires animals to be conscious when their necks are cut, would be prohibited in those regions, as it is in some other parts of Europe. We warned in December about the downstream consequences that the European Court of Justice ruling carried with it. And now we see the outcome, said Rabbi Menachem Margolin, chairman of the European Jewish Association. Jewish freedom of religion is under direct attack. It started in Belgium, moved to Poland and Cyprus, and now it's Greece's turn. The bans on kosher slaughter, or shechitah, are part of a struggle across Europe between animal welfare activists and Muslim and Jewish community representatives. In recent years, anti-immigration activists and politicians who are unhappy about the immigration of Muslims in Europe have joined the debate. A similar fight is unfolding around non-medical circumcision of boys, or Brit Milah, in the Jewish tradition. So this is the latest in a series of decisions, and that, like I said, has a long history in Europe of trying to balance various competing interests, including animal rights. And as we see at the end, it's interesting that some of the more conservative or right-wing politicians are unhappy about immigration of Muslims into Europe are also joining on board. And so it's kind of from both directions, left and right, there is an assault on shechitah. And this has serious repercussions for anyone who wants to have meat, have kosher meat on the table, or kosher any animals or birds that require shechitah, as was noted by a shochet who came from the Soviet Union. In the first source there, that he gives testimony, I was formerly a shochet in a neighboring town where I was persecuted so relentlessly that I had to pull up my stakes and leave. The rabbi and other religious functionaries also had to give up. But without a rabbi, a Jew can get along. Without a teacher, perhaps also, but without a shochet, Judaism, God forbid, would disappear altogether. Right? As we know, it's all about the Jews and the food. So who needs a rabbi? Who needs a teacher? Everybody needs a shochet. But this has been something that has been going on for quite some time, and it is making its appearance. I guess we discussed circumcision. And those who are fighting against circumcision a couple of weeks ago. I guess now it's time for us to deal with the other side of the knife with regards to shechitah. But this is something that's, for 150 years has been something that has been discussed. One of the first places to ban shechitah was in Switzerland, some 160 years ago, 1860. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals persuaded one of the cantons in Switzerland, one of the regions of Switzerland that was bordered with Germany, that all cattle had to be stunned before slaughter. When we talk about stun, you think about different ways. The original way for stunning cattle before slaughter was to take a sledgehammer and stun them, thinking that if they're stunned and unconscious, they feel less pain. But that was the very beginning, and this was something that spread from there. Especially Switzerland was the first. The entire country, Parliament in 1893 ratified a constitutional amendment expressly forbidding the bleeding of meat animals without preliminary stunning, and it remains the law in Switzerland even until today. So, so this is something that has been discussed for a long time. It led to a whole discussion as to whether shechitah, Jewish ritual slaughter, is a humane way of taking care of the issue, as well as some of the responses. Now, what would be, if you live in Switzerland and you can't have kosher shechitah, it could be the solution is you get your meat from somewhere else, right? Just get it from somewhere that does require shechitah. But what happens if they keep banning it in different places? And that's what the article references, that things will get worse and worse and worse and worse until there's nowhere to bring in your meat from. And on some level, it was a perfect storm of a combination of countries where Jews became more part of the society, which was sometimes good for the Jews, but also bad for the Jews in terms of facing institutional and governmental policies that were anti-Semitic. Because once they were members of the society, then those who were against them had an opportunity to try and cut them down or minimize their rights. Plus, you also have the beginning of animal rights activists. Some have said that on some level, right, with Darwin, right, if you believe in the theory of evolution, then human beings are just one level removed. We're all part of that same chain of evolution. If we want to, why should we be cruel to our ancestors by killing animals? It also was pointed out by one author that sometimes people begin to feel a kinship with animals, and we're transposing human experiences onto wildlife. So, for example, one writer suggests, like Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, 1865, was published. And if you think back to that book, or you remember the characters in it, right? These were animals acting like humans, and so there's a kind of anthropomorphism. We often talk about anthropomorphism in Jewish circles with regards to anthropomorphism with regard to God. But anthropomorphism is that they're attributing human attributes to animals. And in the mid-19th century, this was gaining a widespread audience, and even more so, think about the 20th century with cartoons and Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and everything like that. It's an interesting theory that connects some of the animal rights, the rise in animal rights movements, to the fact that we're seeing animals as having human characteristics. So it all, leads to, led historically to this, to a growth in this movement, especially in Central Europe. There were some bright spots, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. If you go further west, England, for example, had in 1925 came out in support that shechitah was not inhumane, and it was an appropriate way of doing it. But really, this became a major, the nexus of this issue was Switzerland, Germany, obviously, post World War I, the rise of the Nazis. It's a whole different issue. And we're going to talk a little bit about how, some of the issues that are found, and also how Jews might respond. What are some of the halachic responses and practical responses? Questions, comments, reactions to the laying of the setting of the table of what it was of these shechitah bans throughout history. Okay, so let's, something to, keep in mind that initially one of the challenge was, is shechitah a humane form of slaughter? Especially if it was the animal rights individuals that were challenging this. If it was an anti-Semitic, let's stick it to the Jews, which it clearly was.
Rabbi,
In the Nazi era, that was different. But what about, is it humane or not? Yes.
I do have a question. Is recreational hunting acceptable in these places where they're banning shechitah?
Probably. I mean, I
Are they-
don't know. I have to check, but that's I don't know. Are they consistent? That's a good question.
Yeah.
But if they are, does that make you feel better?
Yes.
All right. I think that, I think what we're going to try to explore is that, certainly from a Jewish perspective, there's nothing, the first question we're going to look at is,
Can you repeat Aviva's question, please?
do they hunt in the countries where they ban shechitah? So,
And then eat what they hunted, correct?
well, that's irrelevant. It's
Is
really
that the
more.
question?
No, the question is, if they allow hunting, then forbidding shechitah is really targeting the religious audiences. So that's, if they, are they consistent? If they forbid shechitah, do they forbid recreational hunting? Well, we can see what Google says about that. But I think for the Muslim and Jewish communities don't see this as hunting. They see this as something that's humane, and it pays to look at a little bit sort of how shechitah is performed and how it takes place, and and whether the Jewish approach or view of how shechitah takes place, is that humane? Just if it's humane from a religious perspective, what about from a scientific perspective? And in general, the way shechitah has to take place is by a very sharp knife severing the esophagus, as well as the windpipe. And there are a lot of rules involved in it that also impact. So for example, you notice that Switzerland is only forbidding ritual slaughter if the animal is not stunned. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Is there any way for Jewish law to adapt and allow for the animal to be stunned first? It is interesting because it does seem to indicate they don't mind that the animals are being killed. And again, we can look up the hunting laws, but they don't want the animals to suffer. And if the animal is stunned and doesn't feel the pain, and they talk about anesthetizing the animals, does that make it better? And so when shechitah has been studied by biologists who are familiar with animal anatomy, it has been determined that it is as humane as possible. Now, look, killing an animal, there's going to be something violent there. So there's that source from Stuart Rosen, Physiological Insights into Shechitah. Characterization of shechitah as cutting an animal's throat with descriptions of blood spurting from the neck or of the late muscular spasms are unattractive, to say the least. However, to the uninitiated, coronary artery bypass surgery is also visually unappealing. After review of the physiological issues involved, the experimental data submitted that shechitah is a painless and effective method by which to stun and dispatch an animal in one rapid act. Right? The idea that shechitah, it doesn't need to stun because the animal is stunned and killed in one swift motion, and it qualifies as stunning. It would be a scientific response to what Switzerland is trying to do. Dr. Temple Grandin, who is a non-Jewish scientist who has studied animals for her entire career. You can look, she has a website of dozens of articles. I was relieved and surprised to discover that the animals don't even feel the super sharp blade as it touches their skin. They made no attempt to pull away. Right, the idea thinking that if it was painful, there would be a reaction of the animal away from the blade, and that did not happen. To try and move away and jerk away, reinforcing this idea that it is that the killing of the animal is swift, instantaneous, and as much as possible painless. In fact, part of this was, just like we mentioned, Great Britain came to this conclusion. There was a Humane Slaughter Act way back in 1902, and then it was revised in the 1950s, right? That talks about no method, it's the first source on the second side, no method of slaughtering or handling in connection with slaughtering shall be deemed to comply with the public policy of the United States unless it is humane. Either of the following two methods of slaughtering and handling are hereby found to be humane. In the case of cattle, calves, horses, mules, sheep, swine, or the livestock, all animals are rendered insensible to pain by single blow or a gunshot or an electrical, chemical, or other means that is rapid and effective before being shackled, hoisted, thrown, cast, or cut. All right, stunning is a humane way to, is a humane prerequisite to killing of an animal. Or B, by slaughtering in accordance with the ritual requirements of the Islamic and Jewish faith or any other religious faith that prescribes a method of slaughter, whereby the animal suffers loss of consciousness by anemia of the brain caused by simultaneous instantaneous severance of the carotid arteries, the sharp instrument handling in connection with such slaughter. Right, so, with regards to shechitah bans in the United States, would be much heavier lifting. We don't have that history. In fact, we have the history of the opposite of putting into law the fact that shechitah is an acceptable form of slaughter. So in the 1950s, this was revisited. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, in particular, was one of the experts called to testify in Congress about shechitah and about, as we'll discuss, are there ways? Are there ways that that Judaism may be able to adapt its shechitah procedures that would make it more humane? And in particular, is there a way to stun according to Jewish law that would make it acceptable in these various European bans that are being passed, as well as getting at the heart as to the opposition of the against shechitah. These bans are coming, as was mentioned before. There's the being humane slaughter, treating the animals properly, animal rights activists, as well as we'll see. There's another piece of this law which we'll talk about in just a moment. But first of all, we're going to talk about, is there a way for, can shechitah be brought up to the animal rights standards of what would qualify as humane and appropriate and painless for slaughter? So that's with regard to humane slaughter. It's regard to how the scientific community has treated it, how at least in America that has been accepted. Questions, comments, reaction. I'm sure this is making everybody hungry for meat. Okay. So what about this idea of stunning? Well, it was mentioned in the article that stunning is what everyone wants, so the animal doesn't feel pain, but it's not okay for Jewish law. So part of that is that the animal must be conscious at the time of slaughtering, and part of that has to do with some of the things that are going to the nuances of the slaughtering. So we said that it has to be a very sharp knife, it has to be a very quick incision and cutting and cutting through it. Cutting through those arteries, cutting through the esophagus, making the blood come out quickly. There's certain things like, for example, they talk about shackle and hoist. It was something that was referenced in the U.S. law. Has anyone ever seen shechitah? Not sure anyone wants to see shechitah, but I have not witnessed it live. But it's kind of something that rabbis study the laws of shechitah as part of smicha studies, but we don't actually do it. It's kind of it's kind of like academic learning. But part of it has to do with the fact that one of the rules of the shechitah has to do with the fact that the cutting has to really be done koach gavra. It has to be the person, and as opposed to, for example, gravity. So, for example, if the neck is leaning on the knife, and that leads to the cutting taking place, then that's a problem of the slaughtering. And so that's one of the oppositions to the to stunning is the fact that if the animal is stunned, it's not awake, that it's leaning on the knife, and that is something that would invalidate the shechitah. You could argue, well, you can pick the animal up or find other ways of keeping the animal up once it is stunned. And these are issues which have been discussed over time. Part of it, as we will see, is that there's if there's a traditional way of going through shechitah in certain opposition to things which don't fit, are we willing to change them? And that really leads to the question as to whether or not, do the rabbis ever deal with stunning? Do this ever come up? And so in the second source of the second side, Ari Zivotofsky, someone who often talks about Jewish law and science and changes to science and changes to technology in Jewish law, talked about how rabbis tried to find ways to permit stunning the animal and slaughtering. So he writes, some German rabbis, foremost among them Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg of Berlin, valiantly searched for such permission within the Jewish legal codes. They scoured the sources, conducted scientific experiments, and determined the effect of the prevalent study methods, and sent delegations to consult with the leading Eastern European rabbis. Some rabbis reluctantly expressed their willingness to consider sanctioning such slaughter under the dire circumstances they were facing. Note, there were no rabbis who viewed it as an acceptable means under normal conditions. However, rabbinic opinion quickly coalesced around no to any form of pre-shechitah stunning, even under the Nazi regime, and the community as a whole was willing to forego meat. And once there was a consensus that pre-slaughter stunning was unacceptable, there's today no dissension. There are no mainstream rabbinic authorities who will permit stunning prior to shechitah under any circumstances. The next source is Rabbi Yitzhak Yaakov Weiss, prominent authority, used to be in England and in Israel. And he talks about, in the Hebrew, I'll read it and translate it, is electric stunning. We have to be worried about this. And even, he talks about some of the precedents that he had found in the Talmud about animals that had fallen asleep before slaughtering and the like. If you even drug an animal, just like he said, that is something that is it could be dangerous. Also, when we do these things, when you stun the animal or drug the animal, what kind of physiological impact does it have on the animal itself? And as he concludes, maybe it becomes mitarefes, becomes treif. We studied this last year when we talked about the non-kosher restaurants, right? Treif isn't just non-kosher. Treif is what happens to an animal that it is considered a perfectly would seem to be from a kosher species. A cow, for example, can still be considered treifa if certain things have happened to it, right? The Talmud has a listing of things which automatically make kosher animals into treifas. Has to do with injuries and wounds and the like. And it's unclear whether, in this type of a situation, whether the stunning or the drugging of the animal may turn it into a treifa. In which case, even if the slaughter takes place properly, the animal is by definition a treifa animal. Right? I'm not saying it's a non-kosher animal because it is a kosher animal, but it's a kosher animal that has become a treifa, and therefore, there's no way around this, and therefore the idea of stunning has as Zivotofsky says it's turned into a no, and it's not going to be done. And yes, questions. So, so we have, so stunning would be something. Now, the question is, would we be able to, find a way to would we be able to find a way to make it better? The last source on the second page from Zivotofsky writing on this subject, from a philosophical perspective, the current situation would seem to be clear. The current stunning techniques are not clearly better than the shechitah and are very prone to error. thus denying the Jews the right to perform shechitah is ethically problematic. Right? You're saying Jews should stun, but we're not allowed to stun. So, however, the hypothetical question can be raised regarding future developments. Zivotofsky leaves open the possibility that maybe we will find a way forward. Maybe slaughter methods will change, or maybe stunning methods will change. In the fact that slaughter and the mechanics involved in slaughter, or the technology that allows for stunning will change, is something that can be studied. It just happened to be that in the last 150 years, when stunning has been deemed a prerequisite to shechitah in some places, there's been no acceptable form that has been determined usable by the rabbis. But Zivotofsky says, if you find some way that addresses all of these possible questions, we will allow stunning to take place, because it has happened. The Jewish form of slaughter, the knife is the same, the cutting is the same, but the positioning of the animal, there have been different approaches. Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch talks about this on the third page, the top source, in his responsa. And I'll read some of it and of course translate. But in America, Uvod Harbe Artzos, and some other countries, lots of other countries, Nagu lahatir shchitas behemas gasas beofen shebehemas omedes al ragleha vashchita nasas milamata lekivan mala. The way it is the animal is standing and the knife goes from down to up into the neck of the animal. And even though there seems to be an opinion that does not allow this, it's a machlokas. Some don't, some forbid it, and some permit it. And Rabbi Sternbuch says, I was asked, Mikehila Achas America. I was asked by a community in America that they normally had not eaten from animal slaughter this way. Since it's a disputed method of slaughter, they had avoided it. But now it's become more popular. So they would like to allow meat slaughter this way and make it acceptable. Ever wonder sometimes about the different kosher supervisions? Like you buy one chicken, it has 4 kosher signs on it. And a lot of that has to do with the method of shechitah, how the animal is slaughtered or how the bird is slaughtered. Part of it is politics and money, because as we've said, kosher is the unholy trinity of money, power, and religion. But the reason why it has the OU and the Hasidic symbol has to do with confirming how the animal is slaughtered. And so a community which had not made use of this form of slaughter, everyone's doing it. So maybe we can rely upon it. And Rabbi Sternbuch says, well, actually, he thinks, no, if you have a certain practice, you should not change your practice, right? That's, for example, the Hasidic groups will only have Hasidic shechitah, it's called. And this has to do with how the knife is prepared. It was one of the major points of dispute and departure between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim when the Hasidic movement was founded in the 18th century. Actually, the Hasidim allowed for more modern methods of sharpening the knife. And that was an innovation in which the opponents of the Hasidim rejected, and they basically said that, it's not kosher. But Hasidim said this is the only way it can be done. So that's why Hasidim had the practice of having Hasidic shechitah. It had to be done their way. And, so that's why, I remember growing up, certain kinds of chicken were Hasidic shechitah and certain kinds weren't Hasidic shechitah. And Rav Sternbuch says, if you have a practice, you have to stick with it. And he felt that, those asking the question should not be lenient. But, but he says, also part of the problem is that the regulations for shechitah slaughter were such that maybe they would require this type of shechitah. And he said, well, still, you have your custom, and it's 4 lines from the bottom. Do it differently, right? But then he says that he heard from the Satmar Rebbe that if you're in America and you don't have no choice, if the regulations were in place that require this type of standing shechitah, and you had to follow those laws for it to be kosher, then it would be allowed. And so this is not the difference is that stunning, the rabbis were not able to find any type of allowance of permission. This type of standing shechitah seemed to be much more acceptable according to the codes, according to the consensus of opinions. But we do see, from Zivotofsky's comment about stunning and Sternbuch's comment about acceptable slaughter being able to shift, even if it wasn't the way it was always done. Things may change over time, and maybe things will develop. Just in terms of the laws being passed, they're saying, well, you have to stun or you can't slaughter. Maybe this should be a reason to find ways, or we'll develop ways that we'll be able to stun and then slaughter. But as Zivotofsky notes, if there's no acceptable mechanism of shechitah that includes stunning, then these laws, as he points out, denying Jews the right to perform shechitah is ethically problematic. And so that it may change, but for now, we don't have a way of slaughtering that would conform to the prerequisite of the stunning. So therefore, the laws are unethical or immoral. The other piece that was raised is that one of the other parts of the law is that some places are not going to ban shechitah, but they're going to require that all meat be labeled slaughtered, if it is slaughtered. And so you're wondering, well, of course, Jews need that because it has to be kosher. But this relates to the fact that we have very far fewer porgers than we used to. And you know what porging is? Anyone here ever have a chance to kosher their own meat? Even
Yeah.
Okay. So when was the last time you koshered your own meat? Huh?
I think I was 14 years old.
All right.
I'm not telling you how long.
Well, it was like about 10, 15 years ago. I got it.
Exactly.
But koshering meat.
I used to kosher my own meat. I had and when I moved here, I still koshered my own meat because the kosher butcher, Ivels, did not kosher the meat, only the chopped meat. They koshered the meat before they chopped it. So, but after a while, I gave up my koshering pail and made it into a washing pail. And that was the end after the Glatt kosher butchers.
By the way, the cutting it before the koshering is a machlokes. So that's definitely something that has developed. That was a complication of this. But these days there's very little koshering going on. There's even less of what's called porging. You know what porging is?
No.
So it relates to the mitzvah class, where the next mitzvah we're going to talk about is the Gid Hanasheh.
The pulling of the veins.
Correct, because you can't eat the Gid Hanasheh, the sciatic nerve, but how to pull that out and how to remove the prohibited veins and other parts of the animal that are forbidden from the hind quarter is a unique and complicated activity. It's a skill, and it's one that pretty much very few people had ever had, and which led to the fact that most hind quarters of kosher slaughtered animals are sold to non-kosher butchers, right? Instead of going through the practice of pulling the things, of pulling out the various veins in the fats around the Gid Hanasheh, what's generally done is that they would just forget about it. Get rid of it, or cut their losses and sell it to a non-Jewish butcher. This is why it's there are certain cuts of steak which are not available in kosher, like filet mignon. You don't really find very much kosher filet mignon out there because that it comes from that cut of steak comes from that part of the animal. But it's not impossible. It's just it's very uncommon because it's a skill and you have to find the person. It's expensive, etc. But if the animal is now labeled as, if all meat it's sold has to be labeled if it's slaughtered, what will happen is that it might be harder for the Jewish slaughterhouse owner or butcher to pawn off the hind quarter to non-Jewish or non-kosher butchers because it's labeled. Right, Zivotofsky, this is the second to last source on the second side. The second type of law now being considered by several governments, most significantly the European Union Parliament, will greatly impact the availability of kosher meat. It is a labeling law. Here, the stated rationale is that shechitah will still be permitted, but because it is a less acceptable method of slaughter, the consumer is entitled to know how the meat he is consuming met its death. Therefore, any kosher slaughtered meat sold on the general market, such as the trefot or the hindquarters, will be labeled so that the consumer is aware that his animal was slaughtered by a religious method of slaughter. And with all of the discussion, all the conversation, all the efforts of the animal rights activists, no one's going to want, I don't want this slaughtered meat. And it will become it could very much impact the economics of the kosher meat industry, making it much more expensive, making it harder for the slaughter to take place in the first place. It'll have to be imported, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, Phyllis.
On my first trip to Israel, 1972, I believe we had meat that had been deveined. They were doing it in Israel then.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially, when you're trying to get the most out of the animal, and you don't also have a lot less of an opportunity of, pawning it off on non-Jews.
Well, isn't that filet mignon?
Yeah,
Yes.
Exactly.
yeah. And that's why you don't often find it in kosher steakhouses.
That's why
Because-
people go to Israel.
Right,
it was
you're finding it in some other places now. Happens to be that in general, it was a geographic divide. The Sephardim had more of a tradition of how to teach it and teach this, this porging process. They call it nikur they call it nikur in halachic terminology, and but Sephardim have done it more than Ashkenazim, and so that's why. Also as the Sephardic community in the diaspora in America, as an example, has become larger and stronger and better entrenched. In addition to the fact that they have their own unique Beit Yosef requirement for meat, so you'll find more of it available. Even now in the U.S., still, as you point out, you'll find it much more in Israel. But this is another disruptive element with regards to shechitah. It's not an all-out ban, but it is calling attention. That's slaughtered, and therefore becomes problematic it could be problematic for the industry and the economics, and could also be singling out the Jews.
Sounds like what they did the Psagot winery.
Right. Well, the labeling laws, that's
Right.
what, this is what the EU does. See, we're not saying you can't, but we're going to make sure you have to make it clear where it comes from, so that you should feel bad about the product that you buy if we're deeming it unethical or improper. And so that's why Zivotofsky concludes, it's the last source. But thus, while the Jewish community welcomes laws that protect animal welfare, including regulating and restricting recreational activities that may infringe on animals' well-beings, laws that mandate pre-slaughter stunning or the negative labeling of the meat derived from shechitah are viewed as ill-motivated, denying the Jewish community of kosher meat, and counterproductive, and as such should be avoided by all legislatures. Now, remember, Zivotofsky is writing in an academic journal, so he's not going to be as vocal and as decisive as the rabbis who were quoted in the article. But he's looking at it from an academic and a philosophical perspective that you want stunning. Well, shechitah is stunning and killing all at the same time, and you basically, if you require a different type of stunning, then you're splitting hairs way too much and ensuring that the Jews won't be able to do their shechitah. And then the labeling also is unfair singling out. Doesn't mean that the EU system has to worry about those things, but I think that Zivotofsky makes a strong case on rational grounds for where the difficulties are. Some have said, so some countries want to be more progressive or more protective of animal rights than others, so they're doing that, so get the kosher meat from somewhere else. Right, a lot of places don't have their own, in-country slaughtering that's taking place of beef in particular. But then it's a slippery slope, because then the net may widen to such an extent that, okay, so then they'll ban it in this country, then they'll ban it in that country, then they'll ban it in the other country. Which becomes difficult. But yeah, and I think that it is, interesting and important to note, especially on a day like Election Day, when we should take our civic duty seriously, how in the United States, kosher slaughter has been protected for quite some time, was written into the laws that were designed for humane slaughter, and has, which makes it something that less of a worry for American Jews. Again, what different localities, municipalities do, as they have attempted to do with circumcision, that's a separate issue. But at least as a country, we don't seem to be in danger of having a shechitah ban here. Questions or comments?
I lost you for a while, so sorry if they're going to
But-
repeat it. But how do they do